Before 1492, the Americas were a world unto themselves. They were two vast continents, stretching from the frozen Arctic tundra to the windswept tip of Tierra del Fuego. This was a land of staggering diversity. There were towering mountain ranges that honestly seemed to scrape the very heavens. There were dense, humid rainforests, just teeming with a symphony of life. Great rivers, like the Mississippi and the Amazon, carved their way through the land. Vast plains covered in a sea of grass were home to enormous herds of bison that moved like a slow, thundering cloud. This was a land shaped by time, by ice, and by the hands of its people. The people who lived here were as diverse as the land itself. They had arrived thousands of years earlier, crossing a land bridge from Asia into this new world. Over millennia, they spread out, adapting and thriving in every corner. They were not one people, but hundreds of distinct nations and cultures, each with its own language, its own traditions, its own unique way of understanding the universe. From the skilled hunters of the far north, who followed the caribou, to the settled farmers of the warm south, in the great sweep of the Americas, several remarkable civilizations rose to prominence. In the high, arid valley of central Mexico, the Aztec Empire flourished. Their capital city, Tenochtitlan, was an engineering marvel, a city of canals, floating gardens, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. It was larger and cleaner than any European city of its time. The Aztecs were fierce warriors and shrewd political operators. They were also deeply religious, with a complex pantheon of gods and a calendar system of stunning accuracy. Further south, nestled high in the Andes Mountains of South America, was the Inca Empire. It was the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas, connected by an extraordinary network of roads and bridges that spanned thousands of miles. The Inca were master stonemasons, their buildings constructed with a precision that still baffles engineers today. They had no written language as we know it, but they kept detailed records using a complex system of knotted strings called the quipu. North of the Aztecs, in what is now the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built magnificent cliff dwellings. Entire villages tucked into the alcoves of sheer canyon walls, apartment-like complexes, some with hundreds of rooms. Further east, along the Mississippi River and its tributaries, the Mississippian culture thrived. They were the mound builders, constructing enormous earthen pyramids and platforms. Their largest city, Cahokia, was a bustling metropolis with a population that may have exceeded London's at the time. The first Europeans to arrive in the Americas were not the Spanish, they were Norsemen, the Vikings. Around the year 1000, nearly 500 years before Columbus, a group of these seafaring adventurers led by Leif Erikson set sail from Greenland. They were seeking new lands, new resources, new opportunities. They landed on the shores of what is now Newfoundland, Canada. They called the land Vinland, the land of wine, for the wild grapes they found growing there. They built a small settlement, a collection of turf and timber longhouses, a temporary foothold on the edge of a vast, unknown continent. Their presence, however, was fleeting. The Vikings were few in number, and they were far from home. They encountered the native peoples of the land, whom they called Skraelings. The interactions were sometimes tense, sometimes violent. They could not sustain their small colony in the face of resistance from the local inhabitants and the sheer difficulty of life so far from their support bases. After only a few years, they packed up and sailed away, abandoning their settlement at Lance o' Meadows. The memory of Vinland faded into the mists of Norse sagas, a half-forgotten tale of a land across the sea. For nearly 5 centuries, the Americas remained isolated from the Old World. But in Europe, forces were at work that would inevitably lead to a new age of exploration. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had disrupted the traditional trade routes to Asia, making spices and silks from the East incredibly expensive. At the same time, a revolution in shipbuilding and navigation was taking place. New ships like the caravel were faster and more maneuverable. Instruments like the astrolabe and the compass allowed sailors to venture farther into the open ocean than ever before. It was in this context of ambition and innovation that an Italian mariner named Christopher Columbus emerged. He was consumed by an idea, one that most experts of his day considered, honestly, pretty foolish. He believed the world was smaller than it truly was, and that he could reach the East Indies by sailing west, across the Atlantic. For years, he shopped his audacious plan to the courts of Europe, seeking a patron who would fund his voyage. He was rejected time and again, but finally in Spain, he found his sponsors. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were eager to expand their influence and find a new source of wealth. They agreed to finance Columbus's daring gamble. Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. His crew was anxious, sailing into an unknown ocean that sailors called the Sea of Darkness. After more than 2 months at sea, on the morning of October 12th, a lookout spotted land. Columbus and his men had reached an island in what we now call the Bahamas. He believed he had found the outskirts of Asia, the Indies. He called the gentle Taino people he met Indians, a misnomer that would stick for centuries. He met indigenous people whom he enslaved and mistreated. Columbus's return to Spain with tales of a new world set off a firestorm of excitement and ambition across Europe. His voyage had opened a door, and now the great powers of the day were eager to rush through it. Both Spain and Portugal were fierce maritime rivals, and both laid claim to these newly found lands. To avoid a conflict, they turned to the most powerful arbiter in their world, the Pope. Pope Alexander VI stepped in to mediate. In 1494, the two kingdoms signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. They drew a line on the map of the world. The treaty drew a longitudinal line through the Atlantic Ocean, about 1,100 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the west of that line was declared to be Spain's domain. Everything to the east, including the coast of Africa and the sea route to India, belonged to Portugal. As it turned out, the line cut through the eastern bulge of South America, which is why Brazil would later be claimed by Portugal. The primary motivations for this frantic push for colonization were clear. They are often summarized as the 3 Gs: gold, glory, God. The Spanish had heard rumors, tales spun by Columbus and others, of fabulous cities of gold. They were desperate to find this wealth to fund their growing empire and their wars in Europe. It was a document born of breathtaking arrogance, a declaration that 2 European nations could divide the entire non-Christian world between them. The 3 forces, gold, glory, God, would drive the Spanish conquest forward with relentless and often brutal energy. Following Columbus, a new generation of Spanish adventurers set their sights on the American mainland. They were the conquistadors, the conquerors. They were men of ambition, hardened by years of war in Europe. They came seeking fortune. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico, with a small force of about 500 men, 16 horses, and a few cannons. He soon learned of a mighty empire in the interior, the Aztec Empire, ruled by an emperor named Moctezuma II. He heard tales of its vast wealth and of its capital city, Tenochtitlan, a city of gold. Against orders from his superior, Cortés decided to march inland and take it. Cortés was a masterful strategist and a cunning diplomat. He understood he could not conquer the powerful Aztecs with his small army alone. He quickly learned of the deep resentments that many surrounding tribes held against their Aztec overlords. Cortés skillfully exploited these divisions, forging alliances with peoples like the Tlaxcalans. With thousands of native allies bolstering his ranks, Cortés marched on Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor, was unsure how to react. Some in his court believed Cortés might be a returning god, Quetzalcoatl. Moctezuma chose a path of diplomacy, welcoming Cortés and his men into the magnificent city. Cortés soon took Moctezuma hostage, hoping to rule the empire through its captive emperor. This act eventually sparked a furious Aztec rebellion. The Spanish were driven from the city in a bloody retreat known as La Noche Triste. But Cortés was not defeated. He regrouped with his Tlaxcalan allies and laid siege to Tenochtitlan. What ultimately doomed the city was not Spanish steel, but an invisible killer. Just over a decade after the fall of the Aztecs, another conquistador, inspired by Cortés's success, set his sights on a larger, wealthier prize. His name was Francisco Pizarro, an older, illiterate man with iron will and boundless ambition. He'd heard rumors of a great southern empire, a land of gold and silver high in the Andes, the Inca Empire. After hard exploratory voyages, he secured a royal patent, and in 1532 led about 180 men and 27 horses into Inca territory. He arrived as the empire was weak. The Inca had just endured a devastating civil war. 2 half-brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, had fought after their father's death. Atahualpa won, but the empire was divided and weakened. At this moment, Pizarro and his small band arrived. Atahualpa, now Sapa Inca, agreed to meet in Cajamarca. He came with thousands of lightly armed attendants, confident, curious, and unprepared. The meeting was a trap. Pizarro had hidden his men armed with steel swords, guns, and cannons around the square. A friar presented a Bible demanding submission. Atahualpa threw it down. Pizarro signaled attack. Cavalry charged the stunned retinue. Guns and the sight of horses and the flash of steel unleashed terror. Thousands died, and Atahualpa was taken prisoner. Atahualpa begged for freedom and promised to fill a room with gold and twice with silver as ransom. Treasure flowed into Cajamarca for months. Temples were stripped of golden plates. Precious artifacts were melted into bullion, one of history's greatest ransoms. Once treasure arrived, Pizarro reneged. Fearing revolt, the Spanish staged a trial on trumped-up charges, and in 1533 they executed Atahualpa. His death shattered the Inca state. Resistance continued for decades, but Spanish conquest of the Andes was nearly assured. The incredible wealth of gold and silver that flowed from Mexico and Peru into Spain did not go unnoticed by Spain's European rivals. France and England grew envious of Spain's burgeoning American empire. They refused the Pope's division at Tordesillas and were determined to claim their own piece of the New World. They first searched for a northwest passage, a sea route through or around North America to the riches of Asia. Giovanni da Verrazzano, John Cabot, both mapped long stretches of the North American coast. The French were the first to establish a significant foothold. They found no gold or silver but found furs. Beaver hats were in high demand in Europe, North American forests teeming with fur-bearing animals. French traders led by Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec in 1608 and built a vast trading network into the interior. Unlike the Spanish conquest model, the French focused on trade and alliance. They built relationships with native tribes, Huron, Algonquin, learning native languages, intermarrying, becoming partners in the fur trade. This made their interactions more cooperative than conquering. The English were slower to settle. The lost colony of Roanoke vanished without a trace. In 1607, they founded Jamestown, Virginia. The early years were brutal. Many colonists were gentlemen unaccustomed to labor, enduring starvation and disease, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. Jamestown survived because of tobacco. European demand for tobacco was insatiable. It created a plantation economy needing vast land and labor. That led to conflicts with native peoples and to the large-scale introduction of African slavery. Further north came settlers with a different aim. Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620. Puritans founded Massachusetts Bay Colony a decade later. They sought religious freedom, not trade or gold, sometimes cooperative, the first Thanksgiving with the Wampanoag, but often marked by misunderstanding, land dispute, and devastating wars like the Pequot War and King Philip's War. The most catastrophic consequence of the European arrival in the Americas was not war, but disease. For thousands of years, the peoples of the Americas had lived in biological isolation. They had no immunity to diseases that had plagued Europe, Asia, and Africa: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. When the Europeans arrived, they brought these invisible killers with them. The results were apocalyptic. Disease swept through native populations far faster than the conquistadors themselves, often clearing the way for conquest. It was the greatest demographic disaster in human history. While Europe gave the Americas its deadly diseases, the Americas gave the world new food crops: potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, maize, corn, which would become a staple for people and livestock worldwide, vanilla, chocolate, beans, squash. These foods revolutionized diets from Ireland to China. The exchange also included animals: horses, cattle, pigs, sheep. The horse, in particular, had a revolutionary impact for Plains Indian groups, transforming hunting and travel. European livestock often devoured native crops and disrupted fragile ecosystems, creating another source of conflict. The Columbian exchange remade the world. It led to a population boom in Europe, Africa, and Asia, fueled by high-calorie crops from the Americas. It also led to the depopulation of the Americas and the destruction of its ancient societies. The labor shortage created by the Great Dying led directly to the transatlantic slave trade. millions of Africans forcibly transported to the Americas to work under brutal conditions. The colonization of the Americas was a story of epic proportions. It was a story of ambition. It was a story of discovery. It was a story of violence. It was a story of profound transformation. For the European powers, it was the dawn of a new era of global dominance. The immense wealth extracted from the Americas fueled the rise of empires. It financed wars and spurred the growth of capitalism. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the story was one of unimaginable tragedy: loss of life, loss of land, loss of liberty, and the loss of entire ways of being. Yet it is also a story of incredible resilience. Against all odds, indigenous peoples have survived. They have fought to preserve their languages, their traditions, and their identities. Today, they continue to fight for their rights, for their sovereignty, and for a voice in the nations built on their ancestral lands. The legacy of this era is all around us, etched into the landscape, the names of our cities and rivers, the food we eat, and the languages we speak. The deep inequalities within and between nations can often be traced back to the patterns of exploitation established hundreds of years ago. The story of colonization is not distant or finished. It is a living story, and its consequences continue to unfold. To understand America, one must understand this story. It is a story that belongs to all of us, and one we must never forget. It speaks to the best of human nature, our capacity for courage and innovation, and to the worst, our capacity for greed and cruelty. It is the foundational story of the modern world, a story of how one half of the planet connected with the other, with consequences that we are still grappling with today. It reminds us that history is not just dates and facts, but a powerful force that shapes our present and future possibilities. It is a story that belongs to all of us, and one we must never forget.